December 21st, 1944. A German officer was marched into George Patton's map room, with snow melting off his coat and a strip of road map folded inside his glove. Not at the front, not in a field interrogation tent. Inside 3rd Army headquarters in Luxembourg. The officer's hands were cuffed, but his voice was steady. He looked past the MPs, past the radio men, past the wall maps covered in red grease pencil, and said, "General, the road to Bastogne is closed. Your men will freeze before they ever reach it." Every American in the room went still. Because the German was not guessing. He had been captured near a forward command post with fragments of traffic logs, fuel tables, and blocking orders in his pockets. He understood roads. He understood timing. And he understood exactly what would happen if Patton's army failed to turn north fast enough. Patton looked at him for a long second. Then he said one sentence. "Then you have until tomorrow night to be right." The German officer blinked. He had expected rage. He had expected threats. He had expected an American general trying to convince the room that everything was under control. Instead, Patton walked to the map, tapped the road south of Bastogne with one finger, and began explaining the enemy's defeat as if it had already happened. Not loudly, not theatrically, just with the cold confidence of a man who had already done the work. And that is what frightened the prisoner. Because the most dangerous thing in that room was not Patton's temper. It was not his pistols. It was not even the 3rd Army. It was the fact that Patton had started preparing for this moment weeks before anyone gave him permission to believe it was real. To understand why that mattered, you have to see the Ardennes on the morning of December 16th. Before dawn, the forest went white. Snow hung in the trees. Fog pressed down into the valleys. Roads disappeared under slush, ice, and churned mud. Then more than high-Chamgan German soldiers surged west through a sector Allied commanders had treated like a rest zone. The Ardennes was supposed to be quiet. It was where exhausted American units recovered. It was where green divisions got their first taste of combat. It was where the line was thin because the terrain itself was supposed to protect it. That assumption died before breakfast. German artillery opened along a front almost 80 miles wide. Phone lines vanished. Field reports contradicted each other. Units were hit from directions they had not been told to guard. Some held, some broke. Some disappeared so quickly that headquarters did not realize they were gone until the maps were already wrong. Hitler's plan was desperate, but not small. The German offensive through the Ardennes was meant to split the Allied armies, drive for Antwerp, shatter confidence in the Western Front, and buy Germany one last political miracle. For a few terrifying days, it almost looked possible. The weather grounded Allied air power. The P-47s and P-51s that had spent months hunting German columns sat useless on fog-bound fields. German armor moved in daylight through narrow forest roads that should have become killing lanes from the sky. And in the middle of that road net sat Bastogne, a town of a few thousand civilians. 7 roads ran through it. If the Germans held Bastogne, they controlled movement through the southern Ardennes. If the Americans held it, the German drive had a stone in its throat. By December 19th, the 101st Airborne had been thrown into the town by truck, not by parachute. without all of its heavy equipment and with winter closing around it. German units pressed in from multiple directions. Ammunition was rationed. Medical supplies ran low. Wounded men were laid on floors and under tables because there was nowhere else to put them. The town was not just surrounded. It was being measured. Every hour, German commanders asked the same question in different ways. How long before Bastogne cracks? And every Allied commander looking at the broader map saw the same brutal fact. The one army with enough force to break the siege was Patton's Third Army. But Third Army was far to the south, facing east, already committed to another fight. Its supply lines, artillery lanes, traffic control, radio nets, fuel dumps, and marching orders all pointed the wrong direction. To relieve Bastogne, Patton would have to stop an army, turn it 90 degrees, and drive it north in winter through roads already clogged with retreating soldiers, refugees, broken vehicles, and ice. Most staffs would need weeks. Patton told Eisenhower he needed 48 hours. The room at Verdun did not believe him at first, not because Patton lacked courage, because courage cannot move fuel trucks. Courage cannot rewrite route plans. Courage cannot make artillery, infantry, armor, engineers, medical companies, bridging units, and signal teams all turn in the same direction at the same time without destroying the Army's own traffic. But Patton had not waited for permission. For weeks, he had made his staff prepare northward options, not because intelligence had given him perfect proof. It had not. Not because anyone at higher command had ordered him to. They had not. He simply looked at the German pattern and saw a possibility other people dismissed. So he told his people to prepare routes, prepare fuel, prepare alternate axes. Prepare to do something that might never be ordered. That was the part the German officer did not understand when he entered the map room 2 nights later. He thought he was walking into panic. He was walking into a plan that had been waiting for a door to open. The prisoner's name was Major Erich Sattler, an operations officer attached to a German armored formation on the southern shoulder of the offensive. He was not a frontline fanatic waving a pistol in the snow. He was more dangerous than that. He was a staff man. He knew roads. He knew supply. He knew how many gallons armor consumed in freezing weather. He knew how narrow the Ardennes lanes were, how easily one burning truck could turn a route into a wall, and how quickly confidence died when maps stopped matching reality. That was why he spoke calmly. He had seen enough German orders to believe the southern approaches to Bastogne were being sealed. He had heard enough American radio confusion to believe Third Army was reacting too late. So when the MPs brought him into headquarters, he watched the room with the eyes of a man still doing his job. Radio operators repeating fragments, couriers coming in with mud to their knees, staff officers bending over maps under bare electric bulbs, coffee gone cold in tin cups, grease pencil marks scratched, erased, and rewritten. To Sattler, it looked like collapse with better manners. He turned toward Patton and said, "You are moving into a trap." No one answered. He kept going. "The roads north are being cut faster than you can open them. Bastogne will be forced to surrender. If you push armor through those lanes, you will lose men you cannot replace." A young officer near the map table took one step forward. Patton lifted one hand without turning his head. The room froze again. Then Patton asked, "Major, do you believe maps?" Sattler frowned. "I believe roads." Patton smiled slightly. "Good, then this will be easier." He turned to his intelligence chief. "Colonel Koch, give him the roads." Colonel Oscar Koch stepped to the map table with a sheaf of reports under one arm. Koch was not dramatic. He did not enjoy speeches. He had spent weeks warning that German movement in the Ardennes looked offensive, not defensive, and now the room was living inside the warning. He set 3 papers down in front of the prisoner. 4th Armored was already moving north. Elements of the Corps had begun shifting before the last conference notes were dry. Fuel convoys had been redirected under blackout. Engineers were clearing traffic knots ahead of the armored columns. The German blocking units on the southern approach had been identified, fixed, and in some places already hit hard enough that their reports were arriving late or not at all. Koch did not raise his voice. That made it worse. He spoke like a man correcting an accounting error. The road was not open. Not yet. But it was not closed either. It was contested, and contested was enough for Patton. Sattler stared at the map. For the first time his expression changed. Not fear, not surrender. Just the smallest hesitation of a man whose certainty had met information it was not ready to hold. Patton saw it. "You came here to tell me Bastogne is impossible," Patton said. "That is your first mistake. Bastogne is not impossible. It is inconvenient." No one laughed. Patton moved closer to the map. "Your second mistake is thinking we began this turn when Eisenhower asked for it. We began it when your army started behaving like an army with one throw left." Sattler's jaw tightened. "The German army is still advancing." "Yes," Patton said, "and advancing is not the same as winning." He pointed to the bulge pushing westward on the map. "There. That is not strength by itself. That is exposure. Every mile your people drive west stretches the fuel line. Every road junction they miss becomes a liability. Every hour the sky stays closed helps them. Every hour after it opens belongs to us." The room heard the sentence land. "Every hour after it opens belongs to us." Because everyone in 3rd Army headquarters knew the weather forecast. The clouds were supposed to break. Maybe not perfectly. Maybe not everywhere, but enough. And the moment the sky opened, the German columns that had moved through the forest like ghosts would become targets. Sattler understood that too. His eyes went once to the windows, as if he could see through blackout curtains into the weather itself. Patton let him look. Then he said, "By the time you understand what has happened, the lead tanks will already be south of Bastogne." Sattler answered too quickly. "They will be stopped." Patton leaned forward. "Then stop them." That was the moment the room changed, because Patton had not said it like a taunt. He said it like an order he was giving the enemy. If German commanders wanted to stop 4th Armored, they would have to do it with shattered roads, tired men, failing fuel, worsening weather, and an American army that had decided delay was no longer acceptable. Sattler had entered the room believing the American command was calculating whether the impossible could be done. Now he realized they were calculating how much of the impossible had already been completed. Patton turned to the MPs. "Process him. Keep him where he can hear the wireless." The prisoner looked up. Patton's voice dropped. Not because I need him informed, because I want him educated. When the door closed behind Sattler, the room did not celebrate. There was no applause. No one slapped a desk. The radios kept speaking. The maps kept changing. The phones kept ringing. A staff captain finally asked the question every tired man in that room had been carrying. "Sir, do we really make it before Bastogne breaks?" Patton picked up his crop from the edge of the table and looked at the southern road net. "We already told them we would." That was not comfort. It was worse than comfort. It was a standard. By then, the Third Army pivot had become an operation of almost violent coordination. Traffic controllers stood in freezing intersections with flashlights hidden under their coats, waving convoys through darkness one vehicle at a time. Artillery units that had expected to fire east were turned north. Infantrymen slept sitting up in trucks that never seemed to stop long enough for real rest. Mechanics worked with numb hands under canvas hoods, coaxing engines back to life in weather that punished every weak battery and every cracked hose. Fuel was the blood of the movement. Gasoline trucks had to find the armored columns without lights, over roads that changed meaning by the hour. A route marked open at noon could be blocked by a wreck at dusk. A bridge that existed on a map could be gone by morning, and still the columns moved. This was the part that never fits neatly into a victory sentence. Third Army turned north. It sounds clean. It was not clean. It was men crane at frozen couplings. It was dispatch riders taking wrong roads and finding the right officers anyway. It was engineers dragging wrecks out of ditches in the dark. It was staff officers rewriting orders while the ink was still wet on the last version. It was tank crews eating cold food beside machines they could not let freeze. It was the kind of work that looks like confusion from a distance and preparation from the inside. That was Patton's real advantage. Not noise. Not swagger, preparation. He had made the Army rehearse the idea before the idea became official. So when the order came, Third Army was not starting from zero. It was stepping into a shape already drawn. By December 23rd, the weather began to break. At first, it was just a thinning of the ceiling. Then blue opened above the white forest, and the war changed color. Allied fighters rose from airfields that had been silent too long. Thunderbolts hunted German road columns. Mustangs swept rail points and traffic chokeholds. Transport aircraft began dropping supplies into Bastogne, where the 101st had been holding with rationed ammunition and shrinking medical stores. Inside the town, men heard engines overhead and knew the sky had finally come back. Outside the town, German commanders understood what that meant. Their offensive had depended on weather as much as surprise. Now surprise was gone, and the weather had betrayed them. But the corridor to Bastogne still had to be forced open from the south. That job fell to the 4th Armored Division, and at the tip of the spear were tankers who had been driving, fighting, stopping, fixing, and driving again until time lost its ordinary meaning. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams and the 37th Tank Battalion pushed toward the southern perimeter through villages and roadblocks that had been turned into teeth. The Germans knew what was at stake. If the Americans reached Bastogne, the siege would not simply be relieved. The southern shoulder of the entire offensive would begin to rot from the inside. So every road became a demand. Every crossroads became a bill. By December 26th, Abram's lead elements were close enough for men to say the town's name in the present tense. Not Bastogne is somewhere ahead, but Bastogne is there. And then the road stopped being a road. Near the village of Ardennes, German infantry and anti-tank guns had locked the approach. The lane narrowed. Buildings crowded the line of advance. Fields offered little room for armored maneuver. Smoke, snow, hedges, wreckage, and fire turned distance into guesswork. The lead tanks could see where they needed to go. They could not simply drive there. A direct push risked burning the column in the road. A slower method might preserve vehicles and lose the promise. Abrams radioed the problem back. The message that reached command was brutally simple. The town was close. The road was held. Daylight was running out. At headquarters, the choice came down to minutes. An artillery preparation first would take time. A maneuver around the position would take more. Waiting for perfect conditions would mean admitting that the enemy still owned the tempo. Patton had built the entire operation around refusing that. The answer came back with no room for poetry. Artillery and armor together. Not artillery, then armor. Together. The guns would land close enough to make the German defenders lift their heads at the wrong moment. And the tanks would drive into that violence before the position could breathe again. It was not safe. It was not elegant. It was the kind of decision that only makes sense when the alternative is letting the clock become the enemy's weapon. The guns opened. Seconds later, Abrams' tanks moved. Through Ardennes, the world became noise and white flashes. German infantry tried to hold in cellars, doorways, and roadside cuts. Anti-tank crews swung their guns towards silhouettes emerging through smoke. One Sherman was hit and stopped in the road. The tanks behind it did not stop. They bent around the wreck and kept moving. That was the whole operation in miniature. Something blocked the road. The road changed shape around it. A gun fired from the left and missed. A second round struck home. Flames climbed from another Sherman. Men bailed out and ran forward anyway. Because in that moment, even being dismounted did not mean being out of the advance. 4 minutes in a village can last longer than an hour on a clock. 4 minutes is enough time for a promise to fail. 4 minutes is enough time for a column to hesitate. 4 minutes is enough time for men who have been told to reach Bastogne to decide whether orders are words or facts. Abrams did not let the column become a question. The tanks punched through. Then the message came back. Bastogne reached. At the southern edge of the perimeter, American armor made contact with men of the 101st Airborne, who had been holding the town through cold, shellfire, hunger, and exhaustion. The siege was broken, not cleanly, not magically, but physically. A corridor existed where, hours earlier, there had been only enemy fire and a road the Germans believed they controlled. Inside Bastogne, paratroopers came out of frozen positions to touch the tanks. Some shouted. Some simply stared. Some laughed in that strange way men laughed when the body has survived something the mind has not caught up to. The town had not been saved by one speech. It had not been saved by one tank. It had been saved by a chain of decisions, each one made before the easy proof arrived. The forecast before the sky cleared. The routes before the order came. The fuel before the pivot was official. The promise before the road was open. That night, Major Sattler heard the news over a radio in a prisoner compound. The guards did not need to explain it. Bastogne had been relieved. American armor had broken through. The Third Army had done the thing he had called impossible. For a long time, Sattler said nothing. Another prisoner asked him what Patton had said in the headquarters. Sattler kept his eyes on the radio. He said I had until tomorrow night to be right. The other man waited. Sattler swallowed. Then he took the road away from us. That was the part he could not escape. Not that Patton had been loud. Not that Patton had insulted him. Not that an American general had enjoyed humiliating a prisoner. It was worse. Patton had treated the German warning as useful confirmation. A staff officer brought him enemy fear dressed as certainty, and Patton turned it into fuel for his own room. Because that was what the promise had really been for. Not the prisoner, the staff, the radio men, the exhausted officers, the drivers and clerks and couriers and liaison men who had been awake so long that their hands shook over the maps. Patton had made the outcome public in front of a man who expected failure. He forced everyone in the room to live inside the future he had already prepared. That is leadership at its most dangerous and most misunderstood. It can look like arrogance from the outside. Sometimes it is arrogance. But in December 1944, the difference was hidden under the maps. Arrogance says, I can do it, because the sentence feels good. Preparation says, I can do it, because the fuel is already moving. Patton's confidence was not a mood. It was a receipt. The Ardennes offensive would continue for weeks. Men would still freeze, bleed, and die in forests that seemed designed to swallow armies whole. The Battle of the Bulge was not ended in one afternoon south of Bastogne, but the German plan had lost something it could not replace. The southern shoulder had cracked. The road net had been denied. The town that was supposed to anchor German momentum had become the proof that momentum could be broken. And Patton's Third Army, which had been facing the wrong direction on the wrong front in the wrong weather, had turned itself into the answer faster than the enemy believed an army could move. Later, people would argue about Patton the man. They always had. He was brilliant and difficult, disciplined in war and reckless in speech. A commander who could inspire devotion in 1 hour and fury in the next. He crossed the Rhine in March 1945 with the same aggressive impatience that had defined him in the Ardennes. He drove through Germany at a pace that left maps aging overnight. Then, after victory, peace exposed the parts of him war had made useful and politics could not tolerate. He would die in December 1945 after a car accident in Germany, almost exactly 1 year after the winter confrontation in Luxembourg. That ending feels too small for the kind of man people wanted Patton to be. But the lesson of Bastogne was never that great men control fate. They do not. The lesson was narrower, cleaner, more useful. There are moments when history opens a door for only a few minutes. Most people begin preparing when they see it open. Patton had prepared while it was still a wall. That is why, when a German officer walked into his headquarters with a map full of closed roads, Patton did not need to pretend he was calm. He simply showed him the roads already moving. And when the prisoner said Bastogne could not be reached, Patton did not answer with hope. He answered with work that had already begun. The promise was made in that room, but it was kept long before then. It was kept in every quiet route study no one had asked for, every fuel point placed before the crisis, every staff officer forced to plan for an offensive others refused to see. Every driver who turned north in the dark because someone had prepared the road before the order existed. That is why Bastogne heard tanks. That is why the map changed. And that is why the German officer's warning failed. He thought he was threatening a man with the future. He was speaking to the one man in the room who had already been there.